Okay, so let's dive right in. This time you guys sent us some, well, really interesting stuff to unpack.
Yeah, this one's, it's pretty deep.
It is. It's all about the challenges that Pan-African leaders have faced, like historically and even now.
It's making this argument, right? That Western powers, they've got this whole history of getting involved in Africa, not always in the best way.
Right, like interfering, basically, to keep their own influence going. And it's not just like vague ideas.
No.
They bring up all these historical examples, and then they tie it all in with what's happening with Rwanda's president, Paul Kagame.
Paul Kagame, yeah.
Yeah.
He's a key figure for this whole discussion. It's really fascinating how they connect it all.
To really get this, though, you kind of have to understand, like, what Pan-Africanism really means at its core, right?
Absolutely. So Pan-Africanism, it's not just a word, it's a vision, right? It's this whole idea of a unified Africa.
Right, like all the African nations working together, not against each other.
Exactly, and it's about true self-governance. Africans making decisions for Africa.
And not being exploited, which, let's be honest, has happened a lot historically.
Unfortunately, yeah. Now think about it, right? You're a powerful nation, and you've benefited from, well, let's say a less united Africa.
Yeah, an Africa that's maybe a bit more dependent on outside help.
Exactly. So when this Pan-Africanism thing starts gaining traction, well, you might see it as a threat.
A threat to your own power, right?
To your interests, to your control. That's how the source frames it anyway.
So, where do we even start with this deep dive? It feels huge.
Well, I think the heart of it is this, the source claims there are actual strategies, tactics that Western powers have used to undermine Pan-African leaders.
Like a playbook, almost. Wow, that's...
Yeah, that's the word they use, a playbook.
So we're going to look at this alleged playbook, right?
Mm-hmm.
And then see how it applies to Paul Kagame in Rwanda today.
It's about understanding this perspective, even if it challenges what we think we know.
Right, it's about challenging assumptions. Okay, so the source jumps right in, saying that when Pan-African leaders, when they really push for things like sovereignty, economic independence.
Yeah, when they try to, strengthen ties between African nations.
It's seen as a threat, like we were saying.
Not just a difference of opinion, but a direct threat to the power structure.
And they bring up some pretty major historical figures, Kwame Nkrumah of Ghana.
Yeah, a giant.
And Thomas Sankara from Burkina Faso. These guys were like the early champions of Pan-Africanism.
They were way ahead of their time, really. And the source makes it clear they faced a lot of opposition.
Not just, we disagree with your ideas kind of opposition.
No, it was a lot more well-organized.
Like deliberate.
Yeah. So like I was saying, a playbook. That's how the source describes it.
Okay, so we've got this playbook. What's in it? What kind of plays are we talking about?
Well, the first one they hit hard is, they call it framing and criminalization.
Framing. Like how something is presented.
Exactly. The idea is that Western media institutions, they paint these Pan-African leaders in a bad light no matter what.
Even if they're popular with their own people.
Even then, it doesn't matter what their policies actually are. It's about perception, you see.
So they get labeled dictators or corrupt. Yeah.
Exactly. And that sticks. It shapes how the whole world sees them.
And the source provides examples of this.
Oh yeah, they go right into it. So, Thomas Sankara, right? The guy was labeled radical, dangerous. Why? Because he was anti-imperialist,
He wanted Africa for Africans.
Exactly. And he was genuinely trying to make things better for Burkina Faso, but that made him a target.
And the source even mentions his assassination.
They say it's widely believed that foreign powers were involved. Pretty heavy stuff.
It is. And what about Nkrumah? What happened to him?
Well, the source argues he was overthrown in a coup, and guess what? They say the CIA was backing it. And then, to really cement the narrative, they portray him as a dictator, even though his goal was African unity, reduced in Western influence. It's like they flipped the script.
So it's not just about removing these leaders. It's about controlling how they're remembered.
That's powerful stuff, right?
It is. Okay, so we've got the framing. What's the next play?
Well, think about it. If you want to weaken a leader, what do?
Hit them where it hurts.
Exactly. The economy.
Oh, economic sabotage.
Bingo. The source lays out how they use sanctions, they freeze assets, they put pressure on, like the World Bank, the IMF, those big institutions.
To destabilize the whole country, basically.
And make the leader look weak, incompetent.
And who's their example for this one?
Robert Mugabe.
Oh, from Zimbabwe.
Yep. The source argues that, look, regardless of what you think of his rule, He was hit hard with sanctions, especially after he started land reforms.
The ones that were supposed to redistribute land to black Zimbabweans?
Those are the ones. And the source suggests, while maybe the motivations weren't so pure, maybe it was also about protecting Western economic interests in the region. Interesting, right?
Very interesting. So I've got framing, we've got economic pressure. What's next? This is getting intense.
Well, it escalates, right? If the subtle stuff doesn't work.
They have to get more direct.
That's the argument. The source calls it covert operations and coups.
Wow, so like actual spies, secret missions, regime change.
Yeah. When they really want someone out, they pull out all the stops, according to the source. They talk about supporting opposition groups, maybe even orchestrating those coups ourselves.
That's pretty serious stuff.
It is. And they give some specific examples to back it up. Probably the most famous one is Patrice Lumumba.
The first leader of the Congo, right? Democratically elected.
That's him. And they allege that Belgian and American intelligence were involved in his assassination.
Because he wanted a truly independent Congo.
That was his vision. A unified Congo, controlling its own resources, not letting outsiders exploit them.
And that was a threat to powerful interests.
A big one, according to the source. And then there's Gaddafi, Muammar Gaddafi, in Libya.
He was a controversial figure.
For sure. But the source emphasizes his push for African unity, for economic independence. He even wanted a unified African currency. Bold stuff.
And they argue that his overthrow, even though there were definitely humanitarian concerns.
It wasn't just about that. They say it was also about dismantling his Pan-African vision. And NATO, we were involved in that, right?
It's a big intervention. So that's pretty direct action. What else is in this playbook?
Well, they talk about media manipulation, false narratives being spread.
So like controlling the story that gets told about these leaders.
Exactly. They argue that Western media can be very effective at shaping global perceptions, making someone who's popular at home look like a villain on the world stage.
And that makes it easier to justify other actions, right? Sanctions, even interventions.
That's the idea. And they give a more recent example of this, Julius Malema in South Africa.
Oh yeah, the leader of the economic freedom fighters.
That's him. He's often portrayed as, this radical, divisive figure.
Because he's pushing for things like land reform, economic justice.
Those are big issues in South Africa, right? And the source suggests that, maybe this negative portrayal is intentional, a way to weaken his influence, make his demands seem less legitimate.
It's all about controlling the narrative, it seems like.
A lot of it is. And there's one last piece to this playbook that we need to talk about.
What's that?
Supporting puppet regimes.
Okay, explain that one.
So the idea is that once they've gotten rid of a Pan-African leader, they need someone to replace them, right?
Someone who will play ball, basically.
Exactly. Someone who will put Western interests first, even if it hurts their own people. And the source argues that these regimes, they're often corrupt, authoritarian, but they stay in power because the West keeps them there.
And their historical example for this is?
Mobutu Sese Seko in the Congo. After Lumumba was assassinated, he took over, and he ruled for decades.
With a lot of help from the West.
A lot of help. And the source argues that he basically looted the country, served foreign interests, and kept the Congolese people down.
So that's the playbook, according to this source.
Yeah.
And of course, they bring it all back to Paul Kagame in Rwanda.
Yeah, he's like their modern-day example of all this playing out.
So how does Kagame fit into all of this?
Well, the source acknowledges that Rwanda has made some pretty remarkable progress under his leadership.
They talk about the recovery from the genocide, economic growth, advancements in technology, all that.
They don't deny that, but they argue that despite all this, he faces a lot of pushback from the West.
Why? Because he's doing too well.
In a way, yeah. Because he's standing up for Rwandan sovereignty.
Not letting Western powers dictate what he does.
Exactly. And they argue that even though there might be some legitimate criticisms of his government...
Like any government, right?
Yes. The intensity of the focus on things like authoritarianism, human rights, it seems out of proportion.
Like they're trying to find something to criticize, even if it's not the whole story.
And they suggest it's because he's resistant to outside interference. He wants to find African solutions for African problems.
So it's that framing thing again. They're shaping the narrative about him.
Exactly. And they point out that, Kagame is actually trying to promote regional integration.
Getting African nations working together, like with the conflict mediation he's done in places like the Central African Republic and Mozambique.
Right, but that doesn't get as much attention in the West.
And of course, they point out that Rwanda has faced actual pressure not just criticism.
Oh yeah, like the threats of aid cuts over their alleged role in the conflict in the DRC.
Which, to be fair, is a really messy situation.
Very messy. And the source argues that, that whole framing ignores the bigger picture, the roles that other actors are playing, maybe even with Western support.
And then there's the whole issue with the secondhand clothing imports.
Right. Rwanda wanted to phase those out, support their own textile industry.
Makes sense, right? Build up their own economy.
But the U.S. threatened to pull their trade benefits under AGOA.
Which would have been a huge economic blow.
Yeah. So it's like they're being punished for trying to stand on their own 2 feet.
And it brings us to the double standard argument, right?
The source says, look, if an ally of the West does something questionable, it's often overlooked.
But if an African leader, even one who's successful, steps out of line,
they face the full force of Western pressure, and they suggest it's because Kagame's success challenges the whole narrative of Africa needing Western guidance.
it's like, how dare you succeed without our help?
Right. So what's the impact of all of this? What happens when you keep silencing these Pan-African leaders?
Well, the source paints a pretty bleak picture. They argue that it leads to more poverty, more dependency, more conflict.
It's a cycle that keeps repeating, and it discourages other potential leaders from stepping up, from putting Africa first.
So what's the solution? What can African nations do about all of this?
The source has some ideas. First, they say, strengthen your own institutions.
Like the African Union.
Yeah, make it stronger, more independent, so it can protect African leaders and promote unity.
Makes sense. What else?
They say, build up your own media.
To counter the Western narrative.
Exactly. Tell your own stories, control your own image, and of course, economic independence is key.
Reducing reliance on foreign aid, building up your own industries.
Right, and they also talk about the importance of grassroots movements, people getting involved, holding their leaders accountable, and resisting outside interference.
So it's a call for action, basically.
Yeah, for African nations to take control of their own destiny. That's the core message here.
And the source is really clear that this isn't just about individual leaders.
No, it's about the future of Africa. It's about whether Africa will be able to chart its own course or whether it will always be subject to outside control.
Heavy stuff.
It is.
So, listener, as you process all of this, we want you to think about something. What are the long-term consequences of outside influence on African nations? Do African leaders really have the power to make their own choices in this global system? Whose voices are we hearing when we talk about Africa, and why are we hearing those voices? These are questions worth thinking about even after this deep dive is over.
Absolutely. It's about thinking critically, challenging assumptions. That's what matters.
And on that note, we'll wrap things up. Until next time, keep diving deep.
Keep questioning, keep learning.
And keep those sources coming. We'll see you in the next deep dive.
See you then.